Hello and welcome to the Try Mechanics podcast. This podcast is all about coffee, which is quite interesting really because actually as I was starting to record this podcast, I was interrupted by a knock at the door, which turned out to be my green coffee beans. So there's a sense of irony in that, of course. So I'm sat here drinking a little bit of coffee, a nice little macchiato. And I'm going to take you through a little story as to why when we think about drinking coffee, maybe some of the issues, if you've been having particularly indigestion type issues, maybe if you've noticed a bit of stuffiness at night or in the morning, that may indicate that you're not really digesting your food properly. Maybe you've noticed that your recovery isn't quite as good as it has been. And you've noticed maybe that you've thought about whether you should go gluten-free because you've had a few bloating issues. You've decided that maybe certain things don't really agree with you. Maybe you're just getting a bit lethargic in the morning and noticing a few of these odd signs that show that maybe you're not really digesting your food properly. The indigestion is a massive problem. It's a massive problem across the world, and I guess the countries that suffer with it most or seem to report suffering most are the Americans and us, really. Other countries seem to not ever struggle with it quite as much, and a lot of that probably comes down to diet choices and various other factors. The fact that we're eating a little bit more fat that can cause indigestion problems because fat can often relax the sphincter at the top of the esophagus, the top of the stomach into the esophagus. So that can cause those kind of indigestion or heartburn issues. But also it can cause issues further down, but also things like carbohydrate and sugar intake. We know that a lot of indigestion might be related to an overactive gut microbiome that produces a bit more gas than we can deal with, and that pressure can produce indigestion. So what's this got to do with coffee? Well, I've had personally a few issue with indigestion, particularly over the last year or so. We trace that back to possibly an issue with my gut microbiome, mostly related to a couple of episodes of food poisoning that I got shortly after certain open water swimming in different places. One after swimming in a race in Maastricht in Holland, and one after swimming in a race over here. And ever since then, I've had quite a fragile gut sometimes to certain foods, particularly quite sensitive to certain carbohydrate loads and particularly things like sugar. But one of the things I've noticed for a long time is I've been diagnosed with something called silent reflux, which is where you get a bit of reflux in the night, often caused by the sphincter at the top of the stomach opening randomly. Now, we pin that down to the fact that after dinner I would always have, or almost always have, a little piece of dark chocolate, really, really dark chocolate, so normally 85-90%. And that can actually cause a delayed reaction of production of kind of serotonin, and that can actually release that sphincter. So it's a well-known phenomenon. And actually, when I started taking a very small dose of melatonin, it seemed to go away and the problems seemed to abate themselves. However, I have still noticed recently that I'm not digesting my dinner quite as well as I should be, shall we say. So particularly when I have a bit too much protein in my evening meal and I have it too late, then I notice these issues start to come back. I tend to feel a bit rubbish around the stomach area in the morning and a few of these things. So I started to look into whether the coffee intake. So coffee's always reported when it comes to indigestion as, oh, you need to cut down your coffee intake. But we know that, you know, if you like something and it's part of your routine, it's very hard to get rid of it. Now, I tried time periods without coffee, less coffee and just having my morning coffee. It didn't seem to make a huge amount of difference. If I added a bit more coffee in throughout the day, again, it didn't seem to make much difference. So I started to believe that it wasn't probably these things. I do tend to find that my heartburn, occasionally when I get it, is worse after things like tomatoes tend to be a bit of a trigger food. But at the end of the day, there was this unearned feeling that I wasn't really recovering particularly well. My digestion wasn't functioning as well as it probably should be. Now, we do know that if you eat later on in the day and have more protein then, you don't really digest it as well, because we know there's an element of kind of slight fatigue as you go, kind of fatigue in the kind of digestion system as you go towards the day. But also circadian rhythm has an impact on things like melatonin, which can then impact on digestion. So as soon as you start producing a lot of melatonin at night, then you tend to start reducing your digestive power, shall we say, both through, we know that melatonin has an effect on things like the function of the pancreas, both on the insulin side of things. We know that so it is better to basically consume most of your calories kind of earlier on in the day, or at least before it gets dark. Now coming back to the coffee thing. So for as long as I can remember, I've had a routine of getting up and having my first morning coffee on a nice, empty stomach in the morning, sat down, and I've never had any heartburn issues in and around that coffee. And I've never really thought about it, because I always thought when it came to these issues that I would know about it relatively soon. Let's say I ate a trigger food, so sometimes like raw tomatoes is a good example, or maybe an hour later I'll feel a little bit of a kind of burning sensation occasionally, and chocolate tends to have that effect maybe an hour or two later if I'd overdone it. But I never had any problems with this morning coffee at all, so I never thought it was a problem. So I've talked to a lot of people about the idea of the kind of pattern recognition and following certain journeys and certain paths to work out what might actually be the root cause of a problem. And this is essentially what medicine is. Medicine is all about following the patterns, following the yellow brick road to end up at the right diagnosis. And that applies to everything. So this problem wasn't quite going away. And I came across a very interesting article which said that if you have indigestion issues, that first morning coffee, i.e. a coffee on an empty stomach, could be the root cause of all of those issues. So I started reading a bit more, and I started doing a bit more research on it. And we know that coffee increases basically the production of gastrin and increases a knock-on effect of the production of hydrochloric acid. But there was some research to suggest that if you produce a load of acid when you don't need it, then it can make a few changes throughout the body. Whether there's a reaction of, I've produced a load of acid, but you haven't given me any food, therefore I need to use some bicarbonate up, or some basically need to neutralise this acid, and this acid might cause some damage to the stomach. But then our stomach is used to being acidic, so I think that side of things maybe not so much. However, there was a little bit of evidence suggesting that if you produce a big load of acid, particularly early on in the day, particularly when you don't need it, that you actually then reduce your ability to produce it later on. Now, this would start to make sense, because the reason that I was having possibly issues with the food, my food not really fully digesting at night or kind of in the evening, might be the fact that protein requires a significant amount of hydrochloric acid to be produced. So I tested this theory before by taking something called betaine HCl, which is basically a replacement for your stomach acid, along with a little bit of apple cider vinegar, which also kind of helps in that side of things. And it always seemed to make an improvement. I always seem to find that if I have that in my evening meal, or have that around that time, that I feel better the next day. So I started thinking about this, and I read in these articles, and it said, well, if you have that first coffee on an empty stomach, then what it causes this kind of knock-on effect throughout the day, that you don't really produce as much hydrochloric acid as you need to. And that can affect things like protein breakdown. So if you have more protein in the evening meal, which as an athlete, we tend to push ourselves, or we do tend to go towards a slightly higher protein intake, particularly in that evening meal. To essentially, tend to have a lot of fish and meat and things. Sometimes combine a few different things. Then that could be the root cause of the problem. But the interesting thing is that I always like to liken these things back to the comparison between the kind of American diet and the British diet, and what I call the indigenous diet, which is an indigenous diet I simply view as a diet that is set up by tradition, that is tried and tested without science, but just happens to work. When it comes to coffee, I guess the best nation we can really look at is Italy. So how do the Italians drink their coffee? And how do the Americans drink their coffee? And how do we drink our coffee as a comparison? So us and the Americans, there's a routine. A lot of people have a black coffee first thing in the morning. So black coffee, or with a small amount of milk or cream on an empty stomach. And we are the ones that have all the indigestion issues, whereas in Italy, they don't seem to have any of those issues at all. Particularly this disease of having indigestion issues at night, which is shockingly surprising, considering they often have an espresso late at night, which you'd think of would be one of the worst things to have if that coffee was related to the indigestion. However, what they don't do is have that coffee first thing in the morning on an empty stomach, because the Italians tend to have a cappuccino, so a milk-based coffee, with their breakfast. They don't tend to get up and have a black coffee, or at least their traditional way of eating isn't that way. Yes, it might have changed, and yes, the kind of cafe revolution of sort of Starbucks and long black coffees. But if you consider the country here that has the worst for indigestion, which is the States by a long way, they often do that. Almost all Americans, where the way they drink their coffee is with sugar, just a dash of sugar, so that definitely doesn't help the kind of stomach issue side of things, and a black coffee at a diner maybe, or in a house, first thing in the morning. And that's the way we're going a little bit. So I thought about this and I decided, right, well, I'm going to stop having that coffee on an empty stomach in the morning and actually start adding a few things to it. So recently I've been adding a few bits to my coffee, or at least having food around it, and that I liked having a coffee on an empty stomach, so I like to keep some things relatively light, but I've actually started zapping an egg yolk through the coffee, which sounds shocking. Like, I think a lot of people will look at that and think, oh, that tastes disgusting. And it's actually something that someone has coined primal egg coffee, but actually it's been something that's been done in Vietnam and various Eastern countries for a very long time. They have traditional egg coffee. Yes, they do tend to add a lot of condensed milk, so it's very sweet, and it tends to be more of a dessert. But whapping an egg yolk through a coffee is actually quite a traditional thing, and it tastes really good. It kind of tastes like a very creamy cappuccino. So I put an egg yolk in it. I've also added a little bit of collagen, a little bit of gelatin powder, which you can't taste, but adds another element of that creaminess. And I'm really quite enjoying it. But one thing I've noticed is that my digestion ability in the evening has dramatically increased since I've been doing this. So I'm going to leave it there, because I just wanted to have this little story about the fact that these issues may be present. A lot of people are getting indigestion issues and not really knowing about it. I didn't know about it for a long time. I didn't know I was having these issues. I didn't know I was having this reflux at night. All I knew about was that almost every morning I'd wake up with a slightly stuffy nose, and the back of my nose had something called postnasal drip. And that was because of the irritation of the little flecks of acid coming up that I didn't know about. I also noticed I had a bit of a sicky stomach in the morning, particularly if I ate a lot of meat or protein the night before. And I couldn't really pinpoint that either. And it was also affecting my recovery, because you could think that actually things like my B12 status had gone down, which is strange, seeing as I had a lot of foods that should have lots of B12 in it, but you can't break down B12 properly or absorb it without a good amount of acid. So these things started to add up. And it turns out that it may be related to this first morning coffee. So it's not to say you can't ever have this, but I can't remember a day when I didn't have that. I can't remember a day when I didn't get up and have that coffee, even when not at home. So I want to give this as a good example of something to maybe think about of when these issues arise. Maybe there's more to it than meets the eye, and you've got to do a bit of your own detective work really with this, because you're the one that knows all the ins and outs. And yes, you can hand this over to other people, but actually often when you hand it over to other people, they don't know those little intricate details that make all the difference. Thank you for listening. Hope you find this interesting, and we'll see you soon.